This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
Cost classification and behaviour. And I did promise you we'd start to have a few numbers. Well, we will have a little tiny bit of numbers at the end. But a lot of this, again, is terminology, but terminology that's vital for later chapters when we come to the real numbers. But first of all, cost classification, which is really just terminology. But the first bit of terminology is something we call a cost unit. I said that when in one of the earlier chapters that a big job of the management accountant is to calculate the cost of whatever it is we're producing. Now that may seem obvious. I make desks, we need to know the cost of one desk. But it isn't always quite as obvious. But we have to decide, first of all, what is our cost unit? What is it that we're trying to get the cost of? Now again, I just gave you an example. If I make desks, I think the obvious thing I want the cost of is one desk. It's my cost unit. But look at example 1. It says suggest appropriate cost units for the following businesses. First of all, a car manufacturer. Now, the trouble is I can't see or hear you, otherwise I'd ask you to suggest a cost unit. But this, I think, is very much like the desks. You know, a car manufacturer is making thousands of identical cars. The obvious thing to measure the cost of is one car. That would be our cost unit. But what about a cigarette manufacturer? Now you could say, oh, one cigarette, but the thing is, they don't sell just one cigarette. You know, when we sell them, perhaps they're in packets of 20. So surely my cost unit more sensibly would be one packet, not one cigarette, because of course the packet not only has the cost of the cigarettes within it, but the cost of the packing as well. Or in fact, if we're the manufacturer, we produce packets with perhaps 20 cigarettes in, but when we sell them to the shops, we sell them in blocks of, there are perhaps 10 packets wrapped in plastic. And so maybe our cost unit should be one block, one carton of 10 packets, each containing 20 cigarettes, because it's that carton, that block, that we're selling to our customers. So there's no rule. You know, in the exam, you can't be asked a rule. They might say, what's the most appropriate cost unit? But it's up to us to decide. If I'm the cigarette manufacturer, we'd have to sit down and say, well, what is it that we're going to cost out? And I'm suggesting a carton of 20 packets. I say again, there isn't a rule, but I hope you see my point. But, you know, it's not always immediately obvious. We need to think it through. What about the next one? A builder. A builder building houses. Well, if they're building houses, I think the obvious one is one house. But there is one difference from the car manufacturer. That a car manufacturer who might be selling thousands of the same identical car, well, fine, we only need to know the cost of one of those and we've got the cost of all of them. But a builder, you know, is likely to be building all sorts of different houses. Some might have 2 rooms, some might have 5 rooms. And so the builder is likely to have to cost each house separately. The car manufacturer, no, if they're all identical cars, once you've costed one, you've costed all of them. Finally, an audit company. Or an accounting company, or lawyers, that sort of thing. What would their unit be? All right, what are they selling? They're selling audits But the trouble is, each audit is different. You know, a small company, they may only be spending a few hours. A large company, they may be spending several weeks or months. And so how do they go about costing? Well, I don't know if any of you have any experience working for a firm of accountants, but what they tend to do is work out the cost of 1 hour of work. And they say, well, for every hour we work, it's costing $100. Fine. If one audit takes 10 hours, well, it's $100, that's 1,000. If another takes 20 hours, well, it's $100 an hour, that's 2,000. But the cost unit itself would be an hour of work. Over the page, types of expense that will be incurred by a business. There's the production, the manufacturing costs of actually making the goods. There's going to be admin costs, you know, the cost of the accountants, the reception, whatever, and selling and distribution, selling and delivery costs. Now, they'll comprise the total expenses of the business, but what we're primarily concerned about is the production costs. That's what we're interested in. How much is it actually costing to make our desks? For the moment, we're not interested in these extra expenses that will be of administration and of selling and delivery. And when we look at the production costs, we say there are two types of cost involved. First of all, direct costs. And as I've typed there, direct costs are those costs which can be identified with and allocated to a particular cost unit. Suppose we make desks. There's all sorts of costs involved in making a desk, but the ones we can actually measure, we can take a desk and actually measure in it, are the materials, the wood. We can actually take a desk, we can measure, there's 2 square meters of wood. Wood costs $5 a square meter. We can measure it in each cost unit. And the other one we can measure is the labour, what we call the direct labour. If it takes our workers 2 hours to make a desk, that we can measure. It's taking them 2 hours. And if we pay our labour $10 an hour, fine, that's 20. So it's any cost we can actually measure, identify with each unit, which normally are simply the materials and the labour used actually making it. And those two together we call the prime cost. So you see materials, maybe it is 2 square meters and it's $5 a square meter. So per unit, per desk, $10. Maybe the labour, can't remember what I said before, but let's say it's 3 hours and we pay them $10 an hour. That's 30. And so the total cost so far is 40. These are the direct costs. And the total, that 40, is called the prime cost. So it's only terminology. The direct costs and the total of them is the prime cost. However, that's not the full cost of making a desk. Remember, and we're only interested for the moment in production costs, the costs in the factory. And obviously there's the cost of the wood, the material, the labour. But there'll be lots of other costs in the factory. Things like the rent. If we're renting our factory, it's a cost of the factory, it's a cost of producing the goods. Well, all these other costs we call indirect costs. And again, as I've written, they're also called overheads. But as I've written, they're those costs which are incurred in the course of making a product. but cannot be identified with a particular cost unit. Example 3, examples of it, there's the rent of the factory. Again, I keep repeating, we're only concerned with cost of production. So it's only the rent of the factory, not the rent of the whatever offices we may have. But there will be rent. It may be costing us $10,000 a year. But it's a cost of making these desks, but you can't measure how much rent there is in each desk. So it's an indirect cost or an overhead. Or what about this? The wages of maintenance men or women. The maintenance, it's their job to maintain and repair the machines that we use in the factory. It is wages, so it is labour, but they're not actually making anything. But it is a production cost. Well, it's an indirect cost or an overhead. Another one, depreciation of machines. Now, don't worry too much if you're not familiar with the word depreciation, because it's really paper F3. But I think you've probably heard of it. But since it's machines in the factory, well, it's a cost of production, but it's indirect. You can't measure it in each unit. So only examples there. But we said the cost of production with those two types, direct costs, primarily materials and labour, and all the other factory costs, the indirect or the overheads. Over the page, something we're not particularly worried about, but be aware, there will obviously be non-production costs. And we've already mentioned them, but non-production costs, administration costs, so for instance, the wages of the accounts department. The rent of the offices. Delivery to customers. So there'll be lots of other costs that are non-production. But as I've said so many times, for most things as we go through, we're not interested. It's the production costs we're after. And the top line of that page, the total production cost is the prime cost, the materials and the labour, plus the production overheads, the indirect costs. All right, well, that's cost classification. I'll stop this lecture here, but in the next lecture, we'll look at cost behaviour, which is a slightly different issue. So same chapter, but I'll split it into two.